I've got some props and I need some help to get them in place. I'm going to talk to this whiteboard. So thanks, Mark and Ashley. I've got another prop, and that's a bowl of desert raisins or bush tomatoes. So I'm going to hand them round and invite you to have a taste. The reason I'm handing them round and inviting you to have a taste will become clear as the talk goes on. Now, the diagram I've drawn up here is a way of thinking about livelihood systems that I'll talk through in relation to 1, 2 or 3 examples, depending how I'm going for time, in the desert. So perhaps I can have a timekeeper too to give me a call at 5 minutes. This diagram, called the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework, we brought to Alice Springs through my colleague at CSIRO, Yaheas Maru, and I worked with it and other researchers worked with it, particularly in Desert Knowledge CRC research. And I'll just run you through kind of how it works. Without the mic. I'll start here with outcomes. We all want... oh, look, let's do the karaoke thing. Fantastic. Let's start with outcomes. We all want stuff from our lives, and largely people want different things. But let's say we all want health. We all want good well-being is a kind of a universal thing. And people generally, we think about wanting and are happy and satisfied when they have opportunities to live the kind of lives that are meaningful to them. And we do things in our lives, activities, to get those outcomes. If the outcome stuff's going well, then it builds up our assets, the things we draw on in our lives, not just money and houses and things, but the natural capital of the environment, the social capital, the relationships and the skills and things that we have. How people can use the assets that they've got, how those assets are valued and how they're brought into livelihood strategies depends on this box in the middle here I've called institutions, and that's largely what I'm going to talk about today. We can think of institutions in 2 ways. They're the cultural ways of doing things, the accepted ways of behaving as an individual in society, what's seen as good ethical behaviour, and that varies between cultures. And it's the rules and the laws and the policies that government brings in. In fact, people make governments to bring in rules for things that we can't organise just by ourselves. That's why we have governments. And what these rules are about is managing risks and vulnerabilities. Cultural rules, for example, if you think about a rule you might have at your own campsite, but Aboriginal people had traditionally that you don't wash in the water that you're going to drink. You don't pollute the water you're going to drink. It's a cultural way of doing things to protect the asset, good water, to enable these livelihoods, activities and outcomes. So what you can do in your life is filtered through this institutions box. Other rules, big rules we're trying to bring in now globally to manage climate change for the risk of assets, on assets. I'll talk to this livelihoods framework through 3 examples, and the examples come through research we did with Desert Knowledge Cooperative Research Centre, me and my colleagues, not just in CSIRO but in a number of different organisations. The critical thing we've been looking at is how does this framework work in desert environments? One thing about the framework is it's not static. It's got these arrows indicating that it's a dynamic framework, that there's different influences going on. And our environment in the desert is very different. Our institutions here need to be smart to match those of the very different environments nationally and globally, as Mark indicated. Our livelihood opportunities, what we can do, are classically lumpy in space and time. And the cultures locally, not just Aboriginal culture, but the ways that we do things in the desert frequently mismatch with the institutions that operate elsewhere in Australia or globally. So 3 examples. The first is the bush tomatoes, the desert raisins that I passed around. There's a really big harvest on at the moment. It's very exciting. For example, if you look in IGA East Side, you might see bush tomatoes for sale there. They have been for sale. There hasn't been such a big harvest since 2003. But in recent months, Aboriginal women have been out harvesting large quantities and bush food traders have been buying large quantities. So Peter Yates, who used to run Outback Bush Foods, came back here from Victoria twice over the last month to buy big quantities of bush tomatoes. He's bought in 2 days about a third of the total quantity he bought in 2003, nearly a tonne. Now that big harvest is driven by self-organised Aboriginal activity. It works through Aboriginal cultural institutions. Who can harvest where and how the harvest's done is self-organised by Aboriginal people, and it's a really rare example where government isn't involved in trying to organise Aboriginal people to connect with the market. And those Aboriginal cultural institutions and the link to the market is reliant on bridges to make it work, on institutional bridges. So the bush harvest is enabled by assets, the natural capital being the big rainfall we had 2 years ago, and then the fires. That's what's needed to get big production from the plants out bush. The skills and knowledge of Aboriginal harvesters, their human assets, human capital. The social capital, their relationship with the bush food traders, and knowing how to contact them and encourage them to come and buy their stuff. Financial capital, the capacity of the traders to invest in big purchases and put a lot of money into buying those quantities. And the physical capital, which is really simple. The equipment needs are simple for harvesters, so that it's within their own control, but it's more complicated for traders. But the bush food market is really small, and they're looking nationally for small quantities over time, but the harvest comes in big lumps every perhaps 10 years. It's the traders who do the bridging to the market. They do the storing and packing. They put the money in big lumps and then get a trickle-back return. They also make the bridge to food safety standards and other things that are important in the market. So I'm using them as an example of these bridges between ways of doing things in the desert and the way the rest of the country works. The overall message being that livelihoods opportunities from bush food trading are lumped in space and time, and the traders provide the bridge between the desert assets, cultural practices of harvest and the market, and it's the relationships, the social capital that makes the link. How am I going for time? Okay. Second example I want to talk to is health outcomes from Aboriginal land management. The last State of the Environment report nationally in Australia said that one of 4 standout trends in Australian the Australian environment over the last decade has been the marked increase in involvement of Aboriginal people in environmental land management. And you'd have to interpret that to say the marked increase of involvement of Aboriginal people in formal environmental management, how governments think about natural resource management. Aboriginal land management is a very broad set of activities. It encompasses the mainstream view, which is encouraged by funding, which in government or mainstream parlance means weeds and ferals and fire and managing soil erosion, and a set of practices, activities and institutions to manage these risks from the external environment on the assets or the values of the land, the biodiversity, agricultural production, aesthetics, recreation. But Aboriginal land management also encompasses practices such as hunting, burning to increase productivity, teaching kids, and ceremony that are distinctly Aboriginal. Now, in that whole broad field of Aboriginal land management, there's an evidence base going back 20 or more years for health outcomes from Aboriginal land management. So we're interested in trying to understand better what is it about Aboriginal land management, given it's such a broad set of activities that encourages these health outcomes. Factors such as better diet when people are working on country and more exercise are not to be discounted. They're important. But we considered, on the basis of some quite wide-ranging research, but not biomedical research, that there's a more fundamental factor behind this. Aboriginal land management is an example of a set of activities that can enable contemporary Aboriginal people to act in ways that fit to their cultural worldview of what life is all about. That worldview highlights the close relationship between identity and place and natural resources and caring for country. And most livelihood activities that are available to remote Aboriginal people don't offer that close link. So the health link, particularly that comes out of Aboriginal land management, there's an important factor in there which is to do with the impact of working in Aboriginal land management on stress. Stress researchers have learnt that when people, or animals indeed, some of this comes through research with animal behaviour, when people or organisms learn that they are powerless to have influence on the world, that no matter how they act, they can't do things in ways that they see as important, that fits with their worldview, then people get stressed. And chronic stress quickly leads to chronic disease. But conversely, when people have a sense of mastery or control over their lives, when they're able to affect action in the world that fits with their worldviews, and try to put the world into the shape that's fundamentally important to them, this has a buffering effect of the impact of stress on the body. So you might still be getting the other stresses from poor social conditions or from other factors in your life, but you're psychologically and biomedically stronger, more able to buffer that stress. So we looked at, because Aboriginal land management's so broad, what are some key principles that can buffer this institutional mismatch here between how mainstream view of Aboriginal land management and Aboriginal people's culturally determined views. And that can help promote ways of Aboriginal land management that result in Aboriginal people feeling that their actions are putting in place the right and proper way to behave towards country and family and community. And this doesn't require that Aboriginal land management be done in traditional ways. The world has moved on. Rather, these are principles that we consider are important about whatever Aboriginal people are doing, whether it's weed control or whether it's hunting and ceremony. And those principles are about governance that respects Aboriginal culture and custom and tradition, so respects the role of elders and the skin groups in decision making and the traditional owner relationships, but is adaptive. And the second principle comes out of that. If something's adaptive, things adapt because people learn, and learning needs to be built in as a lifelong process. Relationships, again, are very important. And partnerships, which are all about the funding side of Aboriginal land management, typically, they need to recognise and work on things that all the parties, both Aboriginal land managers and the funders and other parties, agree are important. Often the power relations mean that the priorities get pushed towards what funders see as important. So these are bridging principles in the institution's box, and they're being implemented through people in the desert, such as the land management facilitators who work for Central Land Council and the steering committees for Aboriginal ranger groups and Indigenous protected areas, and important to implement in project design. Thanks. I'll just finish with, I won't do the third example, but I'll just finish with just to reiterate the key messages. Sorry to be looking to notes. I'm not as good as Mark at pulling it all out of my head. The overall messages. Desert environments mean livelihoods will be varied and activities will be clumped in space and time, and the institutions designed elsewhere are often a mismatch with local ways of doing things. People and ways of doing things that bridge across the desert and the mainstream institutions are critical. And importantly, what often doesn't happen is those people and institutions need to be nurtured. They need to be valued and supported. Thanks.